one of the great challenges we may have in Afghanistan hereafter will be the threat from terrorism. And the answer is that we will work with our allies, and particularly the Americans, to see how we can get after that threat from outside Afghanistan back into Afghanistan if it's necessary.
And obviously that is going to be a Taliban-led regime. Can you imagine that the UK and its allies might be working with the Taliban to go after the Islamic State threat? It's, of course, it's not inconceivable, but of course we're pretty clear about who we work with. They need to accord to certain principles and lawful behaviour. If the Taliban are able to demonstrate that they can behave in the way that a normal government would behave in relation to the terrorist threat, then we may well discover that we operate together. But I think we've got to wait and see is the answer as to how they're going to behave in relation to this. And certainly some of the stories we get about the way that they're treating their enemies would mean it would be quite difficult for us to work with them at the moment, I would suspect. Withdrawal, and therefore with it evacuation, is, I think, generally regarded as the hardest phase of any of the phases of war for us as military people. And the reason it's so difficult is you don't really have the initiative. And of course, there has to be a ever diminishing rearguard that protects your back as you're evacuating yourselves. And of course, there comes a point when it really is the last aeroplane out. And there are all sorts of things that could go wrong. Obviously, public disorder is a real challenge. And we saw that 2 weekends ago when a lot of very desperate Afghans tragically made their way onto the runway. And then, of course, there is the threat of terrorism. That threat is not going to go away. And you are at your very most vulnerable at the point at which your last aeroplane is waiting to lift. So I think we should be holding our breath and thinking really hard of, that last aeroplane or several last aeroplane loads, and thinking about what a challenge it's going to be for those very brave people trying to effect their departure in a safe and orderly a fashion as they can.
Foreign Affairs Editor Deborah Haynes joins us now. Deborah, interesting to hear that about that last flight with civilians on board. Just how dangerous is that going to be?
Well, he's describing about how they are obviously in a very dangerous situation anyway. In Kabul airport, the security provided by the Taliban and this very real threat of a terrorist attack, as demonstrated on Thursday with that horrendous suicide bombing. And so the problem that the British and the Americans have is that as they also have to leave, they're going to have their own ability to secure themselves diminishing. And while the last British evacuation flight is happening today, the Americans are still carrying on with their evacuation efforts, and they have a much bigger presence and they have provided the majority of the security. And so when British troops are expected to leave before the Americans, and I think General Carter's thoughts are really with the American forces who will be on that final flight, the very last flight that leaves Kabul airport. And he's saying about how at that moment, that's the moment of maximum risk. Every flight that takes off has risk with it. He said to me in that interview as well that including the threat from a suicide bombing, there's also a very real threat of an attack against one of these aircrafts. You could, fire gunfire at it or mortar fire. And so each plane that takes off has that risk. And as the forces draw down as well, their ability to counter the risk also reduces. So with every flight that goes off and with fewer troops on the ground, the greater the danger. And that's very much what he's alive to. And that's why he uses those words about holding our breath. But you also need to hold your breath for all of those that haven't made these flights. While it's the UK effort, almost 15,000 people evacuated to safety, there are many thousands more still in danger, including interpreters who used to work for the British forces, and they are incredibly scared today.